think so.
Yeah.
The last thing we read was about his Bhagavad Gita going missing.
Yes, that's right. It remained a mystery. Okay. All right then. During 1949, Abai wrote articles in Bengali and submitted them to his godbrother B.P. Keshava Maharaj, who published them in his Gaudiya Patrika. Abai's format for addressing world problems was the same as his spiritual masters. Even at their first meeting in 1922, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati had countered Abai's nationalistic arguments by stressing that the world was neither social nor political nor anything material, but was simply the dearth of transcendental knowledge. Abai simply elaborated on this theme. He never advocated that the ordinary concerns of the world be disregarded, but he stressed that crises can be solved only when the leadership is God-conscious. If Krishna consciousness were put first, other concerns could be brought into line. But without Krishna consciousness, so-called solutions were only folly. Abai began his first Bengali article by quoting an editorial from the Allahabad edition of the Calcutta newspaper Amrita Bazaar. The editor had sorely lamented that India's worst troubles had not yet ended despite national independence. The National Week has begun. The memories of Jallianwala Bagh and political serfdom no longer trouble us. But our trouble is far from being at an end. In the dispensation of providence, mankind cannot have any rest. If one kind of trouble goes, another quickly follows. India, politically free, is faced with difficulties no less serious than those that troubled us under a foreign rule. Abai sealed on this editorial reflection as proof of the basic defect of all worldly plans for amelioration. He pointed out that although India had been subjugated by foreign rulers since the time of Muhammad Ghori, AD 1050, India prior to that had never been subjugated. In those days, India had been a God-conscious nation. It was when India's leaders had abandoned their spiritual heritage that India had fallen. Thus, Indians should see that they were now being punished by the stringent laws of material nature. The honourable editor of Amrit Bazaar Patrika, Abai, noted sadly, if one trouble goes, another quickly follows. But that was stated in the Bhagavad Gita a long time previously. The same theme he had stated in his 1944 Back to Godhead article, and the theme of so many of his letters also. Man, due to his neglect of the Supreme Lord, is being punished by material nature, which is directly controlled by the Supreme Lord. Men may write newspaper articles, pass conferences, and attempt to overcome nature by scientific research, yet they will remain unable to. As they try to escape their punishments, the Supreme Lord will cast them deeper into illusion, and they will fail miserably. Quoted an appropriate Bengali saying, I was trying to make a statue of Shiva, but I ended up making a monkey. In order to rid the world of misery and bring about happiness, we have now created the atomic bomb. Seeing the all-pervading destruction which could take place in the near future by atomic reactions, Western thinkers have become greatly disturbed. Some people try to give consolation, saying that we will only use this atomic energy to bring about happiness. This is also another enigma of the illusory potency. The problem, Abai explained, was that the world was lacking Krishna-conscious devotees. Under the influence of material nature, could never solve the problems of the world. Materialistic illusion was especially prevalent in the Western countries, which Indians should not try to imitate. Perceived, however, that Krishna consciousness would one day reach the West. In the Western countries, there has never been any discussion of the relation between the atomic individual soul and the supreme, complete, conscious personality of Godhead. Neither their activities nor their sin has been investigated. That is why, even though they have made so much material advancement, they are squirming in the burning poison of sensualism. We can be absolutely certain that India's real peace formula will one day reach their ears. Abhai's articles began appearing regularly in the Gaudiya Patrika. His godbrothers appreciated his writings. His denunciation of the materialistic mentality was reminiscent of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati's. In Abhai's hands, the Bhagavad Gita's concept of the Asura demon was no longer merely a depiction of a mythological or legendary enemy. The Asuras had come to life in the modern day Hitler, Churchill, or even an Indian Prime Minister. But, as Abhay pointed out, his denunciation of the misleaders was not his own. He was only repeating the words of Krishna. Hare Krishna. So now slides take over.
During night, he continued his letter writing, attempting to gain a hearing with various organizations and leaders. He wrote the World Pacifist Committee, the President of India, and the Minister of Education. He wrote to the Indian Congress for Cultural Freedom, which wrote back suggesting that Abhay had written them by mistake. He wrote to an official of the All Religion Conference in Bombay, advising that because of their approach, nothing practical would come out of their conference. The practical solution is lying in the transcendental message of Sri Krishna, the personality of Godhead, as given by him in the Bhagavad Gita. On September 14, 1951, he corresponded with Daniel Bailey of the American Reporter, a magazine published by the American Embassy in New Delhi. Abhay pointed out that the philosophy of understanding the absolute truth, as realized by the sages of India, was higher than attempts to combine East and West. Mr. Bailey replied that he was aware of Eastern philosophy and cited the progress of yoga mission in New York City, which he said had some influence on the Protestants in America. But when Abhay asked in one of his articles, Mr. Bailey replied, if we were to give considerable space in the American Reporter to, say, the Gita, we, in all fairness, would have to give equal space to the other philosophies, and our desire is not to endorse or condemn any of them, but simply to assist in a better understanding. In further reply, Abhay differed with Mr. Bailey's contention that people should be encouraged to make their own. Less intelligent men are always guided by those who are superior in knowledge in all spheres of life. Abhay even wrote to the Ford Foundation in Detroit, and a staff assistant wrote back, regret to advise you that we are unable to pursue suggestions concerning the establishment of an association of the intelligent class of people. The Ford Foundation has no program in which specifics you describe might be included. Almost most of his suggestions were rejected, received words of appreciation. A certain Dr. Muhammad Sayyid, PhD, a professor at the University of Allahabad, wrote, you seem to have assimilated the universal teaching of ancient India, which is really laudable. And the governor of Uttar Pradesh replied, you are doing noble work, for nothing is nobler than to be God-minded. Abhay giving advice in his letter, but he was hinting that he could also give practical help. If he could obtain institutional backing, he would teach classes, manage temples, teach temple worship, as well as organize various kinds of field work to propagate the principles of Bhagavad Gita. Usually, he did not spell out exactly how things should be done, but he pointed to the philosophical defects in the present methods and the superiority of working in accord with the Vedic literature. By the grace of his spiritual master, he knew the science of applying Bhagavad Gita to almost any situation. If someone would only show interest, he could teach that person the superiority of working according to Bhagavad Gita. After attending a meeting with a prominent industrialist, had stressed harmonized relationship between labor and management in his factory. Abhay wrote a long letter suggesting the man consider the good effects the congregational chanting of Hare Krishna could produce. Since the factory had a special employees club on launch, Abe suggested that the workers assemble there and chant Hare Krishna. Abe urged everyone to surrender to Krishna, but most people had their own philosophies and took his spirit to be sectarian and proselytizing. But proselytizing. But Bhagavad Gita was universal. Abe wrote, and God could be omitted from any program, even in the name of secular state. Krishna, as a father of all living beings, had jurisdiction over all programs, organizations, and government. Indians, especially, should appreciate the universal scope of Bhagavad Gita. Although Abe always had a plan of action behind suggestion, interest of his correspondent. There wasn't much interest, and he was repeatedly turning down, but he never felt discouraged. He always anticipated finding a sympathizer. He kept copies of his letters and the replies, a note of appreciation or a slideshow of interest being sufficient to elicit from Abhay's another thoughtful reply. He had developed dedication to Lord Chaitanya's mission without expecting leadership from the Gaudiya Math. He still cherished the idea that his god brothers would soon come together and preach, but he didn't put any energies in the matas, since to do so would mean to become involved in one of the factions. Gaudiya Math's internal frame, Abe continued his letter writing campaign alone, introducing himself as a preacher of Bhagavad Gita and editor of Back to Godhead magazine.
1848, Abe closed his Lucknow factory. He had fallen behind his employees' salaries, and since 1946, he had been paying past rent in installments. Continuing the factory became impossible. He lost everything. Srila Prabhupada, I started a big laboratory in Lucknow. Those were golden days. My business flourished like anything. Everyone in the chemical business knew, but then gradually everything dwindled. Some acquaintances in Allahabad. He opened a small factory there in the same city where pharmacy had failed 15 years before. He moved to Allahabad with his son Brindaban and continued manufacturing medicines, while the rest of the family remained at Banerjee Lane in Calcutta. Abe continued his traveling, but now he has saved for months at a time. And then he had the dream a second time. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati appeared before him. Again, he was beckoning, he should take sannyasa. And again, Abe had to put the dream aside. He was a householder with many responsibilities. To take sannyasa would mean to give up everything to earn money. He now had 5 children. Why is Guru Maharaj asking me to take sannyasa? He thought. It was not possible now. The Allahabad business was unsuccessful. At present, the condition of our business is not very good. He wrote his servant Gauranga, who had asked to rejoin him. When the condition gets better and if you are free, at that time I will call for you. He worked earnestly, but results were meager. As with everything else, Abe saw his through the eyes of scripture, and he could not help but think of the verse from Srimad Bhagavatam. Yasyaham anugrahnami harishye taddanam shanaiha tato adanam tyajanti asya swajana dukha dukhitam. When I feel especially merciful towards someone, I gradually take away all his material possessions. His friends and relatives then reject his poverty-stricken and most wretched fellow. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati quote the verse and now he thought of it often. He took it that his presence occurred by Lord Krishna, who was forcing him into a helpless position, freeing him for preaching Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada, somehow or other, my intention for preaching the message of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu increased and the other side decreased. I was not disinclined, but Krishna forced me up. The history is known how it decreased, decreased, decreased. In Srimad Bhagavatam, Queen Kunti had also prayed, "My dear Lord Krishna, your lordship can easily be approached but really exhausted. One who is on the path of material progress, trying to improve himself with respectable parentage, great opulence, high education, and bodily beauty, cannot approach you with sincere feeling." Somebody else would like to read?
Can I read? Srila Prabhupada. So in 1950, I retired. Practically not retired, but a little in touch with business. Whatever is going on, the almost is became nil. Whatever was there, all right. You do whatever you like. Abai's wife independently moved along with her son back to her father's house at 72 Mahatma Gandhi Road. She had reason support was becoming precarious. Abai was spending most of his time away from home. He was gradually separating himself from the family. When after several months, he would meet his wife and children. His father-in-law would criticize him. Always going outside. You are always worshipping God. You are not looking after my family. Whenever he could, Abai would send his family some money. Mr. Sudhir Kumar Dutta, Abai refused. I sometimes noticed how he was thinking so many things about his family, about his writing, about making bigger and bigger in business. What to do? What to do? He was thinking seriously to earn money, more money from his business. Does that mean he has to give more time for his business? And his writing, he had never give up. He was writing more and more, and people sometimes abuse him. Hey, you are writing religious things. You are only thinking of God. Then who will maintain your family? What will you do for the family? Sometimes he argued with them. What has his family given me? What this family has given me? What should I forget about God? This is the real thing. What I'm doing? You cannot realize what I am doing. On a visit to Calcutta, home was his father-in-law, where he was given his own room. When his wife served him dinner, he noticed that everything he had been purchased from the market. How is this? He asked. The cook is sick today, Radharani replied. Abba thought he did not live here at the home of her father, or else she will be spoiled even more. So he moved his family to a new address on Chelta Street. Here he sometimes stayed with his family for a few months, writing articles and doing a minimal amount of business. But most of the time he stayed at Allahabad. In Allahabad, Abhay, now 50, lived like a Panash Prashta or one who has retired from family life, indifferent to the activities of family and business, activities a family man generally considered his prime objects of responsibility and happiness. Can I just stop here? Haribol. Haribol.
Okay, I'll read while waiting for her then. In his writings, Abhay had several times discussed the fatwas, or spiritual divisions of Vedic society: Brahmachari, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Sanya. In the first division, the Brahmachari ashram, a young boy's parents send him to the Kula, where he lives a simple life, studying the Vedic literature under the guidance of his guru. In his childhood and youth, he learns the principles of austerity and spiritual knowledge for his entire life. At age 21, the brahmachari may take a wife and thus the grihastha ashram. Or, like Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he may choose to remain a lifelong brahmachari. In his boyhood, Abhay had remained celibate and had devotion to Krishna from his father and mother. He had lived at home. His upbringing had been the equivalent of brahmachari life. And by marriage, at the age of 21, he had entered the grihastha ashram at the appropriate age. Gaur Mohan's example had shown Abhay how to remain a devotee of Krishna even in family life. And as Vaishnavas, Abhay and his wife had avoided the excesses of materialistic household. At 50, a man is supposed to retire from his family activities, and this stage is called Vanaprastha. In the Vanaprastha ashram, both man and wife agree to abstain from further sexual contact. They may continue living together, but the focus is on spiritual partnership. As Vanaprasthas, they may travel together in India, preparing for their inevitable departure from the material world. Thus, the Vedic ashrams, after allowing one to fulfill material life, enable one to end the cycle of repeated birth and death and attain the eternal spiritual world. He should be able to see by his aging body that inevitable death is approaching, and he should have the good sense to prepare. In the final division, the sannyas ashram, the man places his wife in the care of a grown son and fully dedicates himself to serving the Supreme Lord. Formerly, the sannyas ashram penances in the Himalayas, but in the Gaudiya Vaishnava line, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had emphasized preaching. Although Abhay had not formally defined his status within the 4 ashrams, he appeared to be living more as a vanaprastha than a grihastha. He saw his business failures and his distasteful family situation as Krishna's blessings, freeing him from family responsibilities and turning him wholeheartedly towards executing Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's order to. Someone else would like to read?
I will read Mataji. In Allahabad, Abhay managed to save enough money to revive the printing of Back to the Godhead. And in February 19, his editorial office and home at 57B Canning Road, the first issue in the 8 years appeared. As before, he did everything himself. All the writing, typing, editing, meeting with the printer, and finally distributing the copies by hand, as well as mailing them to respectable leaders throughout India. This, he felt, was the real purpose of living in Allahabad or anywhere. This was the best use of money. The purpose of human life, to engage fully in glorifying other things, were temporary and would soon be lost. When he visited his family in Calcutta, old friends would gather in his room and he would preach with Gita. Abhay invited his wife and family to take part in these discussions. discussion, but they would resolutely sit in an upstairs room, often taking tea as if in defiance of his preaching. Abhay was supporting them. He was still associating with them, but he on preaching, and they were not making it attractive for him to do so within the family. If there were to be a family life for Abhay, then his wife and sons would have recognized and rejoiced in the fact that he was becoming a full-fledged preacher. They would have to understand that his life concerns was to serve his spirit. They could not simply ignore his transformation. They could not insist that he was simply an ordinary man. Abhay continued to try to draw his wife in. She would gradually follow him in a preacher's life. But she had not the slightest interest in her husband's preaching. And why should he spend his days worrying about family, chemicals, and money? Let his relatives criticize, but back to Godhead was the real service he could offer the whole family of mankind. Madhvendra Puri, a great spiritual preceptor and predecessor of Lord out the devotees' indifference to worldly criticism. O regards and forefathers, please excuse me. I am unable to perform any more offerings. Now I have decided to free myself from all reactions to sins simply by remembering anywhere and everywhere the great descendants of Yadu and the great enemy of Kamsa, Lord Krishna. I think that this is sufficient for me. So what is the use of further endeavors? Let the sharp moralists accuse me of being illusions. I do not mind. Expert in Vedic equities may slander me as being misled. Friends and relatives may call me prostitute. My brothers may call me a fool. The wealthy Maimonites may point me out as a mad philosopher, may assert that I am much too proud. Mind does not budge an inch from the determination to serve the lotus feet of Govinda, though unable to do it. Why should he waste time with petty family problems when he had answer to the problems of India? As the knower of Bhagavad Gita, he felt that his first obligation was to offer solution to the complex crisis of war, hunger, crime, all symptoms of godlessness, and if dedicating himself to such work meant that other lesser responsibility suffered, then there was no loss. In March 1952, Abhay published another issue of Back to the Godhead. It was dedicated mostly to the biographical article Abhay and had written about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and his father, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. He, Bhaktivinoda Thakura, vehemently protested against the principle of those pseudo-transcendentalists in the name of Lord Chaitanya. He initiated the reformatory movement by arbitrary contributions while he is still engaged as a high government officer. During his householder life and serving as a magistrate of various descriptions in Bengali, English, Sanskrit, and etc. To present an actual picture of pure devotional activities to the Lord Chaitanya. The Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj got inspiration from his very child all about Srila Thakura Vinoda Bhakti Vinoda movement. He worked as the private secretary of Srila Bhakti Vinoda Thakur, and such Bhakti Vinoda Thakur gave him Srila Saraswati Thakur, the transcendental power of attorney to expose the cause of Lord Chaitanya. And so after Srila Bhakti Vinoda Thakur departed, Srila Saraswati Thakur took up reins of that absorbed in producing his monthly journal. Abhay went about his office only superficially. Sometimes he traveled on the business or taking the night train from Allahabad to Calcutta. Visited his family when his compartment was not crowded. He would turn on a light while others slept. Riding a night train provided a good opportunity to think or even write. Sometimes he would sleep for a few hours and then sit up again and look out the window and the reflected lights of the train compartment shining back at him, the windows reflecting his face. Halfway through the 12-hour journey, the sky would lighten, turning from grey to light blue, and the first white clouds would appear in the sky. Lights in the towns, and hear the train horn warning. When the train slowed and stopped at a station, tea vendors would walk alongside the train windows yelling, "Chai, chai, chai." The loud sing-song dimpling the ears with chai and chai, filling the air with its aroma as hundreds of passengers sipped their morning tea. During his more than 20 years of extensive train travel, Abhay had noticed more and more people smoking cigarettes and more women traveling alone. India was becoming westernized, and the national leaders were paving the way, the blind leading the blind, God without God. They wanted a progressive, industrialized India without Krishna. From the windows, he could see large fields being left uncultivated, and yet people were hungry. Abhay would sometimes read a newspaper and cut out an article that seems to want a reply in back to Godhead, or that sparked an idea for an essay. He would deliberate over how to approach people for assistance, whom to approach, and how to start a society for Krishna conscious devotees. People not only in India but all over the world could take to Krishna consciousness. The Chaitanya Bhagavata had predicted that the name of Lord Chaitanya would one day be known to every town and village. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had wanted that. He had sent preachers to England, but they had only gained a protocol visit with the royalty. They stood in line, bowed before the crown, and then come back to India without effecting any. Abhay thought about sending back to Godhead abroad. His agents, Thacker, Spink, and company had contacts in America and Europe. People read English all over the world, and some of them would surely appreciate the ideas from Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. This was what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta wanted. Krishna consciousness was not for India alone. It was India's greatest gift, and it was for everyone.
Will I start the next chapter?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Jhansi, the League of Devotees. Wanted candidates from any nationality to qualify themselves as real Brahmins for preaching the teachings of Bhagavad Gita for all practical purposes throughout the whole world. Deserving candidates will be provided with free boarding and lodging. Apply. A.C. Bhaktivedanta, founder and secretary of the League of Devotees, Bharti Baba and P.O. Jansi, UP. So does that mean we should all apply now for that? That would be nice. Another 12-hour ride with dozens of stops. The train's rattling and clattering and its rocking from side to side made writing difficult. But Abai, crowded on the wooden bench with other third-class passengers, kept writing. Within the dingy compartment, passengers eyed one another. Soot and dust blew in the open windows as the train sped along. Outside, past the monotonous embankments, bright violet trumpet flowers bloomed on tall stalks in the shallow trackside ditches. Water buffalo and oxen grazed in the distance, or sometimes pulled a plough before a solitary farmer. Abai was going to Jhansi, not for business, but for preaching. 1 month before, in October of 1952, when Abai had visited Jhansi on business, Mr. Dubey Hospital had invited him to lecture at the Gita Mandir. Many Jhansi people appreciated things religious or humanitarian, whether from Vaishnavas, Theosophists, Mayavadis, politicians, or whatever. They regarded almost any path as dharma, as long as it showed some edifying piety or tended towards the public welfare. Mr. Dubey had read with interest several issues of Bhakti Godhead and had therefore requested Abai to speak. Abai had been eager, and he had found keen interest among the audience of more than 100 people, many of them young medical students and graduates from the local Ayurvedic college. Abai was 56, and his commanding presentation of Krishna consciousness had impressed the young, religious-minded people of Jhansi. 25-year-old Prabhakar Mishra, principal of the Vedanta Sanskrit College and head medical officer of the Jhansi Ayurvedic University, saw that Abai was very forceful in his desire to spread Krishna consciousness. Dr. Mishra regarded him as a kind of guru, although dressed in white. Here is a humble person, he thought, a short and stocky Dr. Shastri, just beginning his career in Ayurvedic medicine, was an active young man, fascinated by Abai's purity and his vision of a world movement for distributing India. Older men, like tall, suave Ramcharan Hayaharan Mitra, a utensil shopkeeper who wrote poetry and wore a white Nehru cap, also wanted to learn more about Lord Chaitanya from Abai. Dr. Mullik, who was the Gita Mandir secretary, Dr. Siddhi from the university, along with their wives, had sincerely approached Abai after his talk and asked him to please visit Jhansi again. Abai had come to them not as a pharmaceutical salesman or as a man with family concerns, but purely as a devotee of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Although the specific applications of Krishna consciousness as given by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati were new to his audience, these teachings had interested them, and the more Abai had expressed these teachings and spoken of his ambitions for spreading Krishna's message, the more his hearers had encouraged him. Several of them had suggested he conduct his mission in Jhansi, and they had promised to help him. Dr. Shastri had even invited Abai to come live with him. He would introduce Abai to important citizens and arrange for lectures in the various meeting places of Jhansi. After staying for 10 days, Abai had remembering Jhansi, he had been unable to concentrate on his business. Something more important was on his mind: the need for an association of devotees propagating the teachings and practices of Krishna consciousness worldwide. With the Gaudiya Math now broken into permanent schisms, his God brothers conducting their own private ashrams in separate locales, apparently impervious to any reconciliations, something would have to be done if the overwhelming atmosphere of godlessness were to be corrected. There must emerge, as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had envisioned, a league of preachers with activities worldwide. The nations of the world had sought unity through the League of Nations and recently through the United Nations. They failed, and so were the United Nations, unless it recognized the true spiritual unity and equality of all living beings in terms of their intimate relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Abai did not expect any good to come of such organizations, though their attempts were simply another feature of godlessness. No, creating peace and unity was the duty of Vaishnavas. No, creating peace and unity was the duty of Vaishnavas. So Abai had been thinking that perhaps a likely place to start an organization of devotees would be Jhansi. It wasn't a major city, but at least he had found concerned people. The students had listened and accepted. Abai had sensed a certain lack of sincerity and depth in their appreciation, and a sentimentality that made him doubt their seriousness. But if he could find a few, or even one who was serious, then he would have a beginning. He wanted to preach. That was his mission. Besides, he was already getting older. If something were to begin, it should be now. So he would go to Jhansi again, to stay for an indefinite duration, without much concern for his Allahabad affairs. Without much concern for his Allahabad affairs, Abai left his pharmaceutical business with his son and nephew, informing them that he was going to Jhansi. How do you go next?
As the train pulled into the station, Abai saw Dr. Shastri waving energetically. They rode together by Tanga to Dr. Shastri's dispensary, and the talkative, effusive doctor promised many preaching opportunities. Dr. Shastri also spoke of the law of Jhansi. The site of the present city had formerly been a part of the forest in which Lord Ramachandra had practiced austerities many thousands of years ago. The Pandavas had lived here during their exile, and since then many great Vedic sages had had their hermitages in the area. Jhansi had also been the home of an Indian heroine, Lakshmi Bai, who in the mid-19th century had the Indian independence movement against the British regime. Statues and pictures of Lakshmi Bai riding a horse and holding a sword in her upraised hand were displayed throughout the town. But the Jhansi of 1952 was a crowded, poor city with dirt streets and minimal technological amenities. Dr. Shastri lived alone in a two-story rented building in Jhansi Sipri Bazaar. On the first floor he had his clinic and upstairs his one-room residence, which he had offered to share with Abai. The young but influential doctor was a good person to introduce Abai to receptive citizens of Jhansi, and he was eager to do so. Outgoing and energetic, he moved easily among his town. He was respectful towards Abai, who was twice his age and whom he appreciated as firmly fit of philosophy and way of life. Dr. Shastri saw it as his duty to help Abai, and he gladly introduced Abai to others and arranged for lectures. Abai and Dr. Shastri would cook and eat together like family members. Abai's idea for a League of Devotees, an organization with wide world scope but based in Jhansi. The citizens of Jhansi, he said, should all take part in helping spread Lord Krishna's mission. Lord Chaitanyans have a special responsibility to distribute God consciousness both in India and around the world. Dr. Shastri, in his heart, always it was burning that the whole world was suffering in the materialistic view. Everyone is busy in eat, drink, and be merry. So the whole day he was touring and preaching his mission that was prescribed by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his Guru Maharaj. He was having iron will, determination, and self-confidence about his mission. At all, he was Drida Vrata, staunchly determined. Actually, he was always is preaching Hare Nama, Hare Nama, Hare Nama Eva Kevalam, Kalo Nasti Eva Nasti Eva Nasti Eva Gatir Anyata. No other way except Hare Krishna Nam. So always discussing, sometimes the whole night. He was discussing with me, and sometimes I was fed up. I was requesting, please don't disturb me. Please let me sleep. And he, the old man, he was just like a young man. I was a young chap, and he was just like my friend, my elder brother. He was like my guide and teacher, because the preacher is a friend, philosopher, and guide. Shall we stop here? It's 8.
Yeah, really nice place to stop.
That was so good. So